Chapter 15, Section 4 of J.B. Bury's The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Julie van Mulligem. The Student's Roman Empire, Part 1, by John Bagnall Bury. Chapter 15, The Principate of Claudius, 41 to 54 A.D., Section 4. Messalina. In these small practices the freedmen were aided and abetted by the Empress Messalina. In his youth Claudius had been betrothed to Aemilia Lepida, daughter of the younger Julia, but the marriage was broken off on account of her mother's misconduct. He lost a second bride, Livia Camilla, through her death on the wedding day, and finally married Plautia Ergelinilla, daughter of Plautius Silvanus, who had distinguished himself in Illyricum. Plautia was repudiated on account of an intrigue with the freedman, and Claudius then married Aelia Paetina, by whom he had one daughter. Aelia was also divorced, but from no serious cause, and about 38 A.D. Claudius took a third wife, as has been already mentioned, Valeria Messalina. This remarkable woman was descended, on the father's side, from the race of the orator Messala Corvinus, but by her mother, Domitia Lepida, she was connected with the family of the Caesars. Claudius and Lepida were cousins, being both the grandchildren of Antonius the Triumpher and Octavia, the sister of Augustus. The name of Messalina has become proverbial for unblushing sensuality. The tales that have been preserved of her vices and orgies bear on them the marks of exaggeration, but there can be no doubt that her conduct was dissolute, and that she exercised an evil influence on the women of Rome. She is said to have carried on criminal intrigues with the emperor's freedmen, especially with Narcissus. It seems certain that she and they combined to hoodwink Claudius. They concealed her love affairs with others, and she concealed their peculations. While Messalina indulged her amorous caprices, Narcissus and Pallas built up such great fortunes that when Claudius once complained of want of money, he was told that he would be rich enough if those two freedmen took him into partnership. The position of Messalina seemed secured by the circumstance that she had borne her husband a son, Tiberius Claudius Germanicus, who afterwards received the name Britannicus in memory of the conquest of Britain. He was born in February, shortly after his father's accession, and this was the first case of a son born to a reigning Caesar. But Claudius declined the proposal to confer either upon his son the title Augustus, or upon the empress that of Augusta. But although Messalina was not raised to the rank which had been held by Livia, she received conspicuous honour by the decree which permitted her to write in the Carpentum, the use of which was still generally restricted to persons holding priestly offices at solemn festivals. A like permission had been already granted to the emperor's mother, Antonia. It has been already stated that Claudius recalled his nieces Julia and Agrippina from exile. Agrippina's husband, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, was dead, and some time after her return she married Crispus Passienus. Julia was espoused to Marcus Vinicius. Both ladies were young and attractive, and as the daughters of Germanicus and sisters of Gaius, they both exercised influence and awakened suspicion at the court of Claudius. Agrippina avoided the dangers which surrounded her, but Julia's marked attentions to her uncle excited the jealousy of Messalina. She was driven again into banishment, and died of starvation. The philosopher Seneca, noted for his wealth as well as for his writings, was banished at the same time to Corsica as a lover of Julia, but strange to say his estates were not confiscated. In the following year, 42 A.D., a far more glaring act of injustice was committed to satisfy the vengeance of Messalina. A distinguished nobleman, Appius Silanus, of the Junian gens, had rejected the licentious advances of the empress, and she determined to destroy him, although he had been recently married to her mother Domitia Lapida. As there was no possible ground of charge against him, Messalina and her accomplice Narcissus devised a curious plot. Narcissus entered the emperor's chamber early one morning, and told in accents of alarm that he had dreamt the previous night that Claudius was murdered by Silenus. Messalina then said that she had been visited by the same dream. Claudius, weak and superstitious, was terrified by the startling coincidence, and before he had time to recover from his fright, Silenus himself appeared, according to an appointment which the emperor had made with him. But Claudius in his bewilderment forgot the appointment, and saw in the sudden appearance of Silenus a confirmation of the suspicions which had been aroused by the dreams. Messalina and Narcissus pressed their advantage, and easily persuaded the deceived emperor to issue an order for the immediate execution of Silenus. If this tale can be trusted, it shows how unscrupulous the empress and freedmen were in compassing their ends, and how completely the emperor was dominated by their influence. Many other conspicuous victims were sacrificed to the jealousy or covetousness of Messalina. Among them was Poppaea Sabina, said to be the most beautiful woman of the day, the wife of Lucius Cornelius Scipio. Her real offence was that she tried to fascinate Mnester, a dancer with whom Messalina was in love. But the charge preferred against her was that she committed adultery with Valerius Asiaticus, a nobleman of wealth and influence, who was one of the consuls of the year 47 A.D. He was brought into the trial because Messalina coveted the gardens of Lucullus on the Pincian Hill, which he had inherited. At the same time he was accused of treasonable designs, and was given no opportunity to defend himself before the Senate. The trial took place privately in the palace, sentence was passed on the accused, and he was allowed to choose his own death. He adopted the manner of suicide, which was then in fashion, and after bathing and supping, cut open his veins and let himself bleed to death. Poppaea put an end to her own life before the trial was concluded. So far the plans of Messalina and those of the freedmen had not clashed. The interests of the latter were not threatened by an intrigue with the dancer Mnester, or by the confiscation of the gardens of Asiaticus. But when she engaged in an intrigue with a Roman noble, Gaius Silius, the case was very different, for such a connection was clearly a menace to the throne. A man in the position of Silius would hardly have suffered himself to be drawn into an intrigue with a woman of Messalina's evil reputation, if he had not been urged by motives of ambition. And the interests of the freedmen were bound up in their master's life, and his overthrow would have almost certainly meant their ruin. They determined that Gaius Silius should not attain to the Principate, and as Messalina refused to listen to their warnings, they brought about her fall, 48 A.D. The empress, infatuated with a new lover, induced him to divorce his wife, and promised to wed him after the death of Claudius, whose weak constitution might not be expected to hold out much longer. But at length Silius, weary of his ambiguous and dangerous position, and apprehensive perhaps of the constancy of his paramour, urged her to consent to the bold step of removing Claudius. He undertook to adopt Britannicus, and promised to reign in his name and as his guardian. Messalina, however, was not anxious to gratify his wishes. She feared that when Silius reached the goal of his ambition, he might spurn her from him on account of her licentiousness. Nevertheless, she felt such pleasure in trampling upon public opinion and outraging morality that she consented to celebrate a formal marriage with her lover. Claudius was just then about to set forth for Ostia, but before he started, he was assured by diviners that some evil was destined to befall the husband of Messalina. To avert evil from his own head, he was induced to sanction a pretended marriage between his wife and another. Gaius Silius was chosen to be the sham bridegroom. The betrothal took place in the emperor's presence, and he himself signed the marriage contract. He then started for Ostia, but Messalina remained behind on a plea of indisposition, and, incredible as it may seem, celebrated her marriage with Silius with all the customary festivities. It was an anxious moment for the freedmen, Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus. The destruction of Gaius Silius must at all hazards be effected, and it was necessary to set cautiously to work. The influence which Messalina still possessed had been recently shown by the sentence of death passed on Polybius, who had attempted to interfere between her and her lover. So Narcissus laid a plan to take her unawares, and ensure her fall before she could obtain an interview with her husband. He suborned 2 women who were intimate with Claudius to awaken him to the knowledge of his strange situation. Narcissus was then, according to the pre-arranged plot, summoned to the emperor's presence, and confirmed the strange tale of the marriage of Messalina. Did Claudius, he asked, know that he had been divorced by his own wife? That the people, the senate, the soldiers had witnessed the marriage of Silius? Was he still unaware that, unless he acted promptly, the city was in the hands of the husband of Messalina? The emperor could hardly believe the story, but others of the household bore testimony to its truth, and he was urged to hurry back to Rome with all speed and secure himself in the Praetorian camp. Utterly bewildered and frightened, Claudius let his counsellors do with him what they would, and on his way back to Rome he kept continually asking, "Am I the emperor? Is Silius a private citizen?" Narcissus distrusted Lucius Gata, one of the 2 prefects of the Praetorian Guards, as a friend of Messalina. He therefore induced Claudius to commit to himself the command of the guards for a single day. On obtaining the consent of the emperor, he sent orders to Rome that the house of Silius should be occupied, and all who were present arrested. He obtained a seat in the carriage of the emperor, lest the 2 companions of Claudius, Vitellius and Largus, should weaken his resolution. Lucius Vitellius, who had gained distinction in the East under Tiberius, and had worked himself into the favour of Gaius by unscrupulous flattery, carefully abstained from committing himself to an opinion. To the complaint of Claudius he merely said, "How scandalous! How horrible!" leaving the freedman to bear all the responsibility. Meanwhile, in the house of Silius, the empress was celebrating a vintage festival. The grape juice flowed in streams from the wine-presses, and women, arrayed as bacchantes, with skins flung over their shoulders, performed wild dances. Messalina herself brandishing a thyrsus, and Silius, crowned with ivy at her side, strode about in buskins. A note of discord suddenly broke upon the dissolute scene. A physician, one Vatius Valens, had climbed up a high tree, and when they asked him what he saw, he replied in jest, or by some kind of prevision, "A terrible storm coming from Ostia." Presently the news came that Claudius was indeed coming from Ostia, and coming to avenge. The riotous company was instantly scattered. Silius rushed to the forum to hide his fear under the appearance of business. Messalina fled to the gardens of Lucullus. They were hardly gone when the officers sent by Narcissus arrived, and some of the guests, who were slow in making their escape, were arrested. Messalina had no fear that all was lost. She trusted in her power over her husband. She made arrangements that her children Britannicus and Octavia should meet their father, and silently plead their mother's cause, and she prayed Virbidia, the eldest of the Vestal Virgins, to implore the Pontifex Maximus for pardon. Then, having passed through the city on foot, she set forth on the road to Ostia, and was able to find no better conveyance than a cart which was used to carry garden refuse. But all her endeavours failed. Narcissus prevented Claudius from listening to her cries, and the Vestal, when she met the carriage on its entry into Rome, was dismissed with an assurance that the empress would have an opportunity of defending herself. Claudius visited the house of Silius, and saw in the hall the statue of the culprit's father, which the Senate had ordered to be overthrown, and other sights calculated to increase his indignation. He then proceeded to the camp of the praetorians and ascended the tribunal. Silius would not defend himself, and merely asked for a speedy death. He was immediately executed. The same fate befell Vettius Valens and several others who were charged with abetting Silius in his crime. The dancer Mnester was also put to death on account of his intrigue with Messalina, and likewise a young knight named Sextus Montanus, who had been her lover for only one day. In the meantime Messalina had returned to the Lucullan gardens, and did not yet despair. Her mother, Domitia Lepida, who had stood aloof in the days of her prosperity, came to her in the hour of her distress. She urged her daughter to anticipate the stroke of the executioner by a voluntary death. "Life is over," she said. "Nothing remains but an honourable end." But Messalina was fond of life, and she knew the nature of her husband. Claudius, exhausted by his work of retribution, had retired to the palace to dine, and after dinner he sent a message to the poor woman, bidding her come next day and plead her cause. But Narcissus was determined that she should have no chance of pleading, so he immediately ordered a tribune and some centurions to go and slay the criminal, saying, "Such are the emperor's orders." Messalina, having in vain attempted to pierce herself with the sword, was killed by a blow of the tribune, and the corpse was left to her mother. Claudius meanwhile, under the influence of wine, had forgotten the events which had just passed, and began to ask why the lady tarried. When they told him that she was dead, he merely called for another cup, and never mentioned her again. The Senate decreed that her name should be effaced from all monuments, and Narcissus received as a reward for his services the insignia of the quaestorship. Such it seems to be the least improbable version of the strange story of the crowning insolence of Messalina and her sudden fall. But the episode of her public marriage with Silius will always remain a perplexing riddle, unless some totally new evidence be discovered. End of Chapter 15, Section 4.